In March 2012, the body of 27-year-old Rachel Carter was discovered inside a private medical practice in Seattle, Washington. What first appeared to be a tragic suicide quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. The investigation that followed exposed the dangerous obsession of Dr. Nicholas Grant, a respected OB/GYN, and the web of deception that had entangled Rachel in the months leading up to her death. In September 2011, what began as routine medical visits at Seattle Women's Health Clinic turned into an illicit affair, one that would spiral out of control and end in murder. The morning of March 6, 2012, began like any other in the quiet neighborhood of North Seattle. The air was cold, carrying the faint scent of rain, the kind of dampness that seeped into the bones. It was supposed to be a regular Tuesday, but at 9:45 a.m. that illusion shattered. A missing persons report had been filed just hours before. The call came from Ethan Carter, a 30-year-old architect who had spent the last 2 days trying to reach his wife, Rachel Carter. She had told him she needed time to think, to be alone for a little while. He had given her space. But when she missed work and didn't return his calls, dread settled into his chest like a heavy weight. Rachel was not the kind of woman to vanish without a word. The address linked to her last known whereabouts led officers to a small private residence just outside the city, a place that didn't stand out among the other buildings on the quiet street. From the outside, it looked normal, nothing unusual, no signs of forced entry, no immediate sense of danger. But when the officers stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The house belonged to Dr. Nicholas Grant, a respected OB/GYN with a thriving practice in Seattle. His name was well known in medical circles, praised for his skill and care. He had been Rachel's doctor. As officers moved through the hallway, their boots echoing against the polished wooden floors, they found an unlocked door leading to the guest room. What they saw inside was enough to still the air in their lungs. Rachel Carter lay motionless on the bed, her body draped in a deep red pool of blood that had soaked through the mattress. Her throat was cut cleanly, a precise wound that suggested a controlled hand rather than a frantic attack. The sheets beneath her were twisted, bunched up as though she had struggled in those final moments. The dim morning light filtering through the curtains painted a haunting contrast, the once pristine white bedding now stained with death. Her body had been staged. The positioning, the careful arrangement, it all pointed toward one thing. Someone wanted this to look like a suicide. But even at a glance, it was clear that this was no act of self-inflicted harm. The angle of the wound was unnatural, the force too great. A forensic expert arriving at the scene would later confirm what investigators already suspected. Rachel had not done this to herself. She had been murdered. The room smelled of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and thick, the undeniable scent of blood. Officers noticed small details that didn't sit right. The door had no signs of a break-in. The bedroom window was slightly ajar, a soft breeze pushing the curtains ever so slightly. On the nightstand, there was a half-full glass of water, next to a bottle of sleeping pills that hadn't been touched. No note, no messages left behind, just silence. Rachel's phone, found at the foot of the bed, had been wiped clean. No recent calls, no texts, but forensic analysis would later retrieve fragments of deleted messages, texts sent late at night, calls that had lasted for hours, conversations that traced back to Dr. Nicholas Grant. 2 days later, on the morning of March 8, 2012, detectives arrived at the Carter residence. Ethan Carter answered the door, his face pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He had barely slept since hearing the news. The questioning was routine, but the atmosphere was heavy. Ethan spoke in low, measured words, his mind still struggling to process the reality of his wife's death. He described their marriage, how things had changed after Rachel's miscarriage, how she had become distant, how he had blamed himself for not being able to comfort her. He admitted that Rachel had been spending time at the clinic more often, that she had spoken highly of Dr. Grant, that she had trusted him. Then came the crucial moment. When asked if he suspected Rachel had been seeing anyone, Ethan hesitated. His gaze dropped, hands curling into fists on his lap. He hadn't wanted to believe it, but there were signs. Late-night phone calls she wouldn't explain. Moments when she would come home smelling of something unfamiliar, something not from their home. It was when he finally spoke the doctor's name that the detectives exchanged a look. The pieces were falling into place. Dr. Nicholas Grant, a well-respected physician, a man with no prior record, no history of violence. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that his connection to Rachel Carter was more than just professional. By March 20th, 2012, detectives had enough. It had taken weeks of relentless work, retrieving phone records, interviewing staff at the clinic, tracing financial transactions. They found that Nicholas had booked hotel rooms under fake names. They found security footage of Rachel meeting him late at night. They discovered messages that had been deleted but not completely erased. Messages that revealed a relationship that had spiraled far beyond control. And then there was the final piece, a small, damning detail. Forensic analysis of Rachel's nails had found something, traces of skin embedded deep under the nail beds. A last act of defiance, a struggle, a sign that she had fought for her life. On the afternoon of March 20th, 2012, at exactly 4:30 p.m., officers walked into Seattle Women's Health Clinic, where Dr. Nicholas Grant was attending to patients as if nothing had changed. He barely flinched when they stepped into his office. He didn't panic, didn't argue. He simply stood, straightened his white coat, and held out his wrists as if he had expected this all along. His expression never wavered, even as the handcuffs clicked shut. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something dark. Not fear, not remorse, something else. The waiting room was full when they led him outside. Patients and staff turned to watch, some gasping, others whispering in shock. The man they had trusted for years, the man who had brought life into the world, was now accused of taking one away. As he was escorted into the back of a police car, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, voices shouting his name. He didn't speak, he didn't resist, but in that moment, as he sat behind the tinted glass, one thing was certain: the story was far from over. The early days of September 2011 were filled with pain. Rachel Carter had always imagined pregnancy as a joyful milestone, a step toward the future she had dreamed of with Ethan. But in the middle of a quiet evening, just weeks after she first saw the 2 pink lines on the test, that future was ripped away from her. The miscarriage left her feeling empty, like a part of her had disappeared before she even had the chance to hold it. Ethan, always the steady and rational one, had no idea how to help her. He held her when she cried at night, but never talked about his own feelings. His silence became distance. In the weeks that followed, he buried himself in work, convinced that keeping busy would make things easier for both of them. He didn't notice the way Rachel stayed up late, staring at the ceiling. He didn't see the way she traced a hand over her stomach, mourning something invisible. At first, Rachel told herself she didn't blame him. He was hurting too, in his own way. But as the weeks stretched on, she started to feel like she was grieving alone. That was when she met Dr. Nicholas Grant. Rachel had been referred to his clinic for follow-ups. He was nothing like what she expected from an OB-GYN. He was charming, confident, with a calm voice that made her feel like she wasn't just another patient. He listened. He asked about how she was feeling, not just physically, but emotionally. He told her that pain like hers didn't just fade overnight, that it was okay to struggle. His words felt warm, like a balm over the ache she had been carrying alone. The first time she left his office, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. By October 2011, her appointments became more than just routine checkups. She looked forward to them. The waiting room of the clinic, with its soft music and the scent of antiseptic, became a strange kind of comfort. She wasn't sure when it happened, but something about Nicholas made her feel seen. Every time she walked in, he greeted her with the kind of attention she had started craving. He asked about her job, about her marriage. His voice was smooth, full of interest, as if everything she said mattered. When he suggested they grab a coffee after one of her visits, she didn't say no. By November 2011, Rachel had convinced herself that there was nothing wrong with seeing Nicholas outside of the clinic. They had coffee once a week, sitting in a quiet corner of a small cafe where nobody knew her. She told herself that it was harmless, that she was just grateful to have someone to talk to, but then the lines blurred. The first time Nicholas brushed his hand over hers, she didn't pull away. The first time he leaned in close, his breath warm against her skin, she let him. And the first time they crossed the line, it happened in a place that should have been safe. The sterile white walls of an examination room, the scent of hand sanitizer in the air. She had gone in for a checkup, but the moment his fingers brushed against hers, something changed. The guilt came immediately, but so did the thrill. Rachel told herself it was a mistake, that it wouldn't happen again, but it did, again and again. By December 2011, the affair was no longer just stolen moments. Nicholas became a constant presence in her life. He messaged her every morning, every night. If she didn't respond fast enough, he would send another, and another. At first, it was sweet. It made her feel wanted. But as the weeks passed, the messages started to feel more like demands. Rachel didn't see it at first. She was too lost in the way Nicholas made her feel. But then he started showing up at places she hadn't told him about. One afternoon in January 2012, she walked out of her office to find him waiting near her car. He smiled when he saw her, acting as if it were completely normal that he was there. When she asked how he found her workplace, he laughed it off. He said she had mentioned it once, that he had just been in the area.
Then he started talking about Ethan.
It started as subtle comments, jokes about how Ethan didn't appreciate her, how he didn't know what he had. The way Nicholas spoke about her husband was casual, but dangerous, as if Ethan were an obstacle that needed to be removed. Rachel brushed it off, convinced herself that he was just being protective. But something deep inside her whispered that she should be worried. She ignored it. By February 2012, Rachel started to feel like she was living a double life. At home, she went through the motions of being Ethan's wife, but with Nicholas, she felt alive. The affair was reckless, intense, an escape from the emptiness she had been drowning in, but then she missed her period. It took 2 weeks for her to find the courage to take the test.
Rachel stood in the bathroom, staring at the 2 pink lines, her hands trembling. A wave of panic hit her chest, crushing, suffocating. The baby could be Ethan's, but it could also be Nicholas's.
For the first time since the affair began, she felt real fear. She met Nicholas the next day, her heart pounding the entire drive. She didn't know how to tell him. She expected him to be shocked, maybe even scared. But his reaction was something else,
something cold.
Rachel had imagined 100 different ways he might react. She had prepared for anger, for panic, even for happiness. But she hadn't prepared for the way his eyes darkened, how his expression shifted into something unreadable. She told him she couldn't have this baby. She told him she had already decided. That was the moment Nicholas changed. Everything in him, his warmth, his charm, his obsession, suddenly turned into something else. Something dangerous. The cold air outside carried the scent of rain, the kind that never quite fell, but lingered in the clouds, heavy and waiting. The city had begun to quiet down, but inside a small medical practice, just outside downtown Seattle, something far worse than the brewing storm was about to unfold. At 8:15 p.m. on March 5, 2012, Rachel Carter stepped out of her car and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. The glow of the street lamp cast long shadows across the empty parking lot. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her steps steady. She had made up her mind. This would be the last time she saw Dr. Nicholas Grant. She had spent the entire day rehearsing what she would say. There would be no more stolen moments, no more whispered conversations. This was over. She was going through with the abortion. It didn't matter whose baby it was. What mattered was that this child did not belong in the middle of her mistakes. Inside, the clinic was empty. Nicholas had told her to meet him after hours, that there would be no interruptions. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, reflecting off the sterile white walls. The faint smell of antiseptic filled the air, mixing with something else, something faint but wrong. Tension crackled in the space between them as soon as she stepped into his office. She braced herself, expecting anger, maybe even pleading. But Nicholas didn't beg. He barely even reacted, at least, not at first. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on her as she spoke. When she told him the pregnancy was ending, he didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her otherwise. He just stared, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, his fingers pressing against the desk with a force that made the wood creak. Then, without warning, his entire body shifted. It was as if something inside him snapped. Before she could react, he moved. Rachel barely had time to process what was happening before she felt the force of him knocking her backward. A hand closed around her throat, shoving her against the desk. Panic surged through her, a sharp, electric burst of fear that made her limbs tremble. She struggled, she fought. Her nails clawed at his skin, scraping against his arms, his face. She kicked at him, trying to twist free. But Nicholas had the strength of a man who had already decided there was no going back. The air in her lungs burned. Her vision blurred at the edges. The world around her shrank, folding in on itself as she reached for anything that could stop this. Her fingers grasped at his collar, yanking, tearing. A button popped off, rolling onto the floor. A strand of his hair caught between her fingertips as her hand slid, weak and shaking, toward his face. She knew then that she wasn't going to get out of this. At 8:42 p.m., the fight ended. Rachel's body slumped, her fingers twitching once before falling still. The office was silent, except for the sound of Nicholas's breathing, heavy, uneven. He stepped back, staring down at what he had done. His white coat was stained now, the stark red seeping into the fabric, creeping along the folds like it belonged there. But he didn't panic. He didn't shake. He had spent years inside operating rooms, watching the fragile line between life and death fade in the space of a heartbeat. He knew exactly what needed to happen next. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching the body. His mind worked quickly, cataloguing every detail, every loose end that needed tying up. There could be no mistakes. First, the scene. It had to look clean, planned. He reached for the bottle of sleeping pills on the desk, opened it, and spilled several into Rachel's limp hand. Next, he took the sharp scalpel from the tray near the examination table, pressed it against her neck, and made one careful cut. It had to look controlled, something a woman in distress would do to herself. something a woman who had just made a terrible decision might resort to. At 9:05 p.m., he wiped down the surfaces, the desk, the chair, the doorknob, every place she could have touched. He wrapped the scalpel in a sterile cloth and tucked it away in the medical waste bin. The phone on the desk still had their messages from earlier that day. He deleted them. At 9:20 p.m., he took a final look at his work. The room was silent again. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning, the rhythmic buzz of the fluorescent light. He exhaled, smoothing his hands over the front of his coat, and turned toward the door. Then he saw it, a small red stain on his cuff. His breath caught. He had been careful, so careful. But there it was, a speck of blood, barely noticeable but there. He yanked off the coat, stuffed it into his bag. He could burn it later. He turned off the light, stepped out of the room, locked the door behind him. At 9:37 p.m., Nicholas walked out of the clinic. The night air was cold against his skin. He moved calmly, steadily, like any other man leaving work after a long day. Nobody saw him. Nobody suspected a thing.
What he didn't realize was that Rachel had left behind the one thing that would bring him down.
A single hair clenched between her lifeless fingers. The trial of Dr. Nicholas Grant began on October the 10th, 2012. It had been 7 long months since the night Rachel Carter was murdered, and now the world was watching as justice closed in on the man who had taken her life. Inside the packed courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the defendant. Nicholas sat in his tailored suit, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He had once been admired, respected, trusted. Now he was a monster in the eyes of the public. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece, each revelation making it harder for Nicholas to maintain the calm, composed image he had held onto for so long. The hair strand clutched in Rachel's fingers, the blood on his cuff, the deleted text messages. It was all there, a trail of carelessness that exposed him for what he truly was. Witnesses took the stand. The forensic expert described the brutal precision of the wound, proving Rachel could not have inflicted it on herself. The clinic's janitor recalled seeing Nicholas throw away his stained coat the morning after her death. And then came the phone records, late-night calls, messages that grew darker, more obsessive in the weeks leading up to the murder. At 3:15 p.m. on November 21st, 2012, after only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty. The weight of that single word filled the courtroom, pressing down on everyone inside. Nicholas did not flinch. He remained still, his face as blank as it had been when he was arrested. But Ethan Carter, sitting just feet away, his hands clasped so tightly they had turned white, finally broke. For weeks he had sat in that courtroom, silent, unmoving, barely reacting to the gruesome details of how his wife had died. He had listened as lawyers and experts discussed her as if she were just a case, a name on a file. He had clenched his fists as Nicholas sat there, as if he were just another man in an expensive suit instead of the one who had stolen Rachel from him. And then, at 3:18 p.m., as the judge prepared to deliver the final sentencing, Ethan snapped. The courtroom gasped as he lunged. Before security could react, his fist connected with Nicholas's face, a sharp, brutal blow that sent the doctor sprawling. The force of it echoed through the silent room, a single, violent punctuation to months of grief. Security rushed in, pulling Ethan back, but he didn't resist. His chest heaved, his hands trembled, but his eyes, burning with rage and pain, never left Nicholas. At 3:22 p.m., the judge announced the final sentence: life in prison, no parole. Nicholas was led away in handcuffs, His trial was over. His life, as he knew it, was over. Ethan Carter walked out of the courtroom a free man. But he was not the same man who had walked in. He never would be again. By December 2012, Rachel's name became more than just a memory. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials dissected every detail of the case. The woman caught between love and obsession. The husband who lost everything. The doctor who played God and lost. Her name became a warning, a reminder of how dangerous love can be when it falls into the wrong hands.
Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates, and you can check out another insane case we have. The case where a top surgeon murders his assistant to hide a terrible secret. Make sure to check it out and let us know your thoughts in the comment section.